The wooden hammer slammed down on the auction block, the sound cracking through the dusty deadwood air like a gunshot. Another horse, a fine-looking stallion with muscles that rippled under its hide, sold for more money than Jeremiah Caldwell made in 2 years of breaking his back on a failing farm. It was 1879, and the Dakota Territory was a place built on dreams and desperation. Gold fever was a sickness, and silver was its even more alluring cousin. Jeremiah just needed $5. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, his hand calloused and rough. Beside him, a small, scraggly donkey named Barnabas flicked his long ears, unbothered by the noise and the smell of sweat and manure. Barnabas was an auction regular, a sad, familiar piece of the scenery nobody ever bought. His legs were a little too short, his coat a dusty, forgettable gray. He had the kind of face that made you think he'd already given up. "Next up," called out the auctioneer, Pete Morrison, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. "We got a work donkey." He didn't even try to sound excited. "Sturdy thing, good for haulin' supplies." The crowd of miners and ranchers barely glanced over. A couple of kids pointed at Barnabas and snickered. The little donkey just stood there, his dark eyes taking in everything, silent and still as a stone. "Do I hear $20? Morrison's voice boomed. Silence. A long, awkward silence that stretched out and made Jeremiah's neck feel hot. Somewhere in the crowd, a man coughed. Nobody raised a hand. Nobody even blinked. Jeremiah felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, on his worn-out clothes, on his pathetic, unwanted animal. His wife, Martha, had loved this donkey. Before the fever took her last winter, she'd run her hands through his coarse fur and whisper secrets into his floppy ears. "He's special, Jeremiah," she'd always said. "He sees the world differently." Jeremiah just saw another mouth to feed and a stack of bills that grew taller every week. Selling Barnabas felt like tearing out the last page of a book he loved, but the banker wasn't going to take memories as payment. 15? Pete Morrison tried again, a hint of pity in his voice that was worse than the scorn. A woman in a fancy hat shook her head and turned to her husband, whispering something that made him chuckle. Then, something shifted. Barnabas, who hadn't moved a muscle this whole time, lifted his head. He looked straight out at the sea of faces, his ears swiveling forward as if he were tuning into a secret radio frequency. The chattering of the crowd died down for a second. Everyone stared at the little donkey, who suddenly seemed aware. It was just for a moment, but it was enough to make the air feel thick. $10? Pete's voice cracked. Still nothing. The quiet was a physical weight, pressing down on Jeremiah, making him want to sink right into the dirt. This was it. Utter failure. He wasn't just broke. He was a joke. And then, a rough voice from the back of the crowd cut through the stillness. 5. Pete Morrison squinted, trying to find the bidder. "I've got 5. Do I hear 6? But when he scanned the crowd, the man who had called out was gone. Vanished, like he'd never been there at all. Pete waited, but no one came forward to claim their bid. It was a ghost bid, a cruel joke. The auction moved on, and Jeremiah was left standing there with his unsold donkey, the laughter of the crowd ringing in his ears. He walked home that evening, the weight of his failure heavier than any sack of ore, with Barnabas trotting quietly behind him. The road to his small, dilapidated cabin was long and lonely. He had nothing. No money, no hope, just this one worthless animal his wife had loved. But as they neared the edge of his property, Barnabas stopped dead in his tracks. He turned his head and stared out at the jagged, dark hills to the east, his nostrils flaring wide. He wasn't just looking. He was listening to something Jeremiah couldn't hear, smelling something Jeremiah couldn't smell. He pulled on the lead rope, a sudden, urgent tug. He wanted to go to those hills, and Jeremiah realized, with a chill running down his spine, that his donkey's strange behavior had only just begun. Barnabas stood in the moonlight, a silhouette of stubbornness, staring at the eastern ridge. His ears were locked forward, twitching at phantom sounds that traveled on the cold night wind. Jeremiah, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, felt a growing unease. Hunger did strange things to a man, but he was certain he wasn't imagining this. "What has gotten into you, boy?" he whispered, his boots crunching on the dry dirt. The air felt charged, electric, the way it does right before a storm breaks. For 3 nights since the humiliating auction, it had been the same routine. Barnabas would refuse his meager portion of oats, instead pacing the fence line, always staring east, always pulling. The bank was coming in a week. Jeremiah could already hear the heavy footsteps on his porch, the polite but firm voice demanding money he didn't have. He was at the end of his rope, and his only companion was a donkey who seemed to be losing his mind. Martha's rocking chair sitting on the porch creaked as a gust of wind pushed it. Her voice seemed to whisper in that sound. "Animals sense things we've forgotten how to see, Jeremiah. Trust what Barnabas shows you." He'd thought it was just the rambling of a woman facing her end, but now he wasn't so sure. Barnabas tugged on the rope again. Not a panicked bolt, but a steady, insistent pressure. Jeremiah looked down. In the dirt, the donkey's hooves had scraped a series of lines, like crude arrows, all pointing toward that same dark ridge. As Jeremiah knelt for a closer look, a glint of white caught his eye. Tucked beside a rock was a piece of quartz, smooth as a river stone, glowing faintly in the moonlight. He picked it up. It felt heavy in his hand. Too heavy. And running through it were dark, jagged veins, like black lightning frozen inside the stone. This wasn't normal quartz. It felt different. Alive, almost. "Where did this come from?" he murmured. Barnabas was already nudging another spot with his nose. More of the strange quartz lay scattered there, all of them with those same pulsating dark veins. They weren't from around here. Jeremiah had walked these fields his whole life. He knew every rock and every weed. These stones were new. Martha's voice again, a ghost in his memory. Sometimes the biggest treasures are hidden in the smallest packages. She had been talking about Barnabas, defending him from the neighbors who laughed at the scrawny animal. But maybe she meant something more. A stronger wind blew down from the ridge, carrying the scent of pine, damp earth, and something else. Something metallic and sharp. Barnabas lifted his head and let out a soft bray. A sound so full of yearning it made Jeremiah's heart ache. Whatever was up there in those hills, it was calling to this little donkey like a lover. It was a summons Barnabas couldn't ignore. "All right, old friend," Jeremiah finally said, his hand stroking the donkey's neck. "Tomorrow. We'll go see what all this fuss is about." He tried to sound resolute, but a knot of fear tightened in his gut. "But if this is just some wild donkey chase, we'll be starving before the first snow." Barnabas turned and looked at him, and in the donkey's dark, intelligent eyes, Jeremiah saw no confusion. He saw absolute, unshakable certainty. It was a look that promised tomorrow would change their lives forever. He just didn't know if it would be for better, or for much, much worse. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Black Hills. Jeremiah packed his old prospecting tools, his hands moving with a grim purpose. Barnabas stood nearby, already saddled with makeshift packs, poised like a soldier waiting for the command to charge. His ears were locked on the ridge. He hadn't looked away all night. "Easy now," Jeremiah muttered, cinching a leather strap. "Whatever it is, it's not going anywhere." But Barnabas seemed to think differently. The second Jeremiah finished, the donkey started up the trail, not waiting to be led. He moved with a strange confidence, picking a path through the treacherous scree that a goat would have thought twice about. The climb was brutal. Loose rocks tumbled away under their feet, echoing in the vast emptiness below. Jeremiah slipped twice, his worn boots finding no purchase on the slick shale. Both times, Barnabas planted his hooves like he was part of the mountain itself, a living anchor that kept them both from plunging into the canyon. "How in the world do you know where you're going?" Jeremiah panted, his lungs burning in the thin air. There was no path here, no trail. Yet Barnabas moved as if he were following a paved road, his steps sure and steady. As they got higher, the trees thinned out, replaced by wind-blasted rock and stubborn low-lying brush. Jeremiah felt dizzy, but the donkey only seemed to get stronger, more excited. His pace quickened, his small body straining forward as they neared the crest of the ridge. And then he stopped. Just like that. So abruptly that Jeremiah almost crashed into him. "What is it now?" he asked, scanning the area. There was nothing. Just rock and sky. But Barnabas was staring intently at a sheer rock face, his nostrils twitching, his whole body trembling with anticipation. Jeremiah stepped closer, pushing aside a curtain of dead, dry vines that clung to the rock, and his breath caught in his throat. Hidden behind the foliage was a dark opening, a narrow fissure in the mountain, just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. A cool, damp draft flowed out from it, carrying a scent that made every prospector's heart pound like a drum. The rich, earthy smell of minerals. The smell of fortune. "Well, I'll be," he whispered, his voice trembling as he pulled away the rest of the branches. You knew this was here." He lit his lantern and slipped inside. The beam revealed walls that weren't entirely natural. Someone had been here before. Long ago. There were tool marks on the stone and rotting wooden beams shoring up the ceiling. But they had left in a hurry. A rusted pickaxe lay on the floor next to a shattered lantern. The tunnel sloped downwards, and Jeremiah's light danced off the walls, catching thousands of tiny glittering points of light. He reached out a shaky hand and scraped at the wall with his knife. Beneath a thin layer of grime, a thick, unmistakable vein of pure, shining silver snaked its way into the mountain's heart. It was the mother lode, a strike so rich it defied belief. "Barnabas," he breathed, the name echoing in the silence. "You beautiful, brilliant animal. You found it." Joy, pure and overwhelming, washed over him. They were saved. But as the lantern light swung further down the tunnel, it revealed something else. Fresh markings on the wall. Deep, parallel gouges scraped into the stone, far too wide to be from a pickaxe. They were claw marks. Marks left by something huge, and lying near the entrance was a single coarse brown hair. Something else was using this cave, and it was very, very big. Just as Jeremiah hauled another heavy chunk of silver-laced ore out into the daylight, 3 riders appeared on the trail below. They weren't meandering. They were riding hard, their horses kicking up plumes of dust that choked the mountain air. Barnabas, who had been grazing peacefully, lifted his head, his ears flattening against his skull. The lead rider wore a black hat that shadowed a mean, cruel face. He and his 2 companions had rifles resting across their saddles, and they looked like men who used them often. "Well now, what have we here?" the man in the black hat drawled as he swung down from his horse. He didn't wait for an invitation, just strode right over to Jeremiah's pile of tools. "Looks like we got ourselves a claim jumper." Jeremiah slowly set down his pickaxe, his knuckles white. He knew this kind of trouble. It came with the territory. But the cold dread in his stomach told him this was different. "This is my claim," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Filed it yesterday. Legal and proper." The second rider, a lanky man with a nasty scar across his cheek, let out a dry laugh. "Paperwork," he sneered, not bothering to dismount. "Funny how paperwork can get lost. Or burned." The man in the black hat, the one who seemed to be in charge, nudged the pile of silver ore with the toe of his boot, scattering the precious rocks. "The name's Rusty Brennan," he said, his eyes locking onto Jeremiah's. "And this whole mountain belongs to my boss, a fellow by the name of Pete Morrison. You might know him, runs the auctions down in Deadwood." The name hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. Pete Morrison. The auctioneer who had humiliated him. It hadn't been a random act of cruelty. It was a test. Morrison had been watching him, watching Barnabas. He knew. "You're trespassing, old man," Brennan said, his voice low and menacing. Barnabas took a slow step forward, placing himself directly between Jeremiah and the 3 men. The little donkey didn't cower. He stood his ground, his dark eyes fixed on Brennan, a low rumble starting in his chest. It wasn't a sound a donkey should make. "Your jackass has an attitude problem," the 3rd man chuckled, but it was a nervous sound. "Maybe we ought to teach it some manners." "You lay one hand on him," Jeremiah warned, the fear inside him turning to cold, hard anger. "And you'll regret it." He'd faced down thieves before, but never like this, so far from help, with so much to lose. Brennan smirked and pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat. "Got the real deed right here," he said, waving it like a flag of victory. "Signed and stamped. You got 1 hour to clear out before we clear you out." The paper looked real. The stamp looked official. But Brennan's eyes darted around nervously. He was lying. Jeremiah knew it in his bones. "I'm not going anywhere," Jeremiah said, his voice barely a whisper. "This silver belongs to me, and to Barnabas." Brennan's hand drifted down, hovering just over the butt of his pistol. "Is that so?" he hissed. "Guess we'll just have to—" He never finished the sentence. From deep within the cave, a sound rolled out that was older than the hills themselves, a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Every head snapped toward the dark opening. Something was moving in there. Something massive. Barnabas's ears shot forward. He took 2 steps toward the cave, not in fear, but as if he were greeting an old acquaintance. The growling grew louder, closer, laced with a terrifying fury. And then, a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows within. A colossal grizzly bear emerged into the sunlight, shaking dust from its matted brown fur. It rose up on its hind legs, towering over them, a monster of muscle and rage. Claws like railroad spikes dripped with saliva, and its teeth were yellowed daggers. This was no ordinary bear. It was a scarred old warrior, the undisputed king of this mountain. "Sweet Mary," Brennan breathed, his hand frozen above his gun, all the swagger gone from his face. The bear's tiny, intelligent black eyes sized them all up. It sniffed the air, its great head swinging back and forth, reading a story written in scent that the men couldn't comprehend. And then the most impossible thing happened. The bear looked directly at Barnabas. It let out a soft, huffing sound, a sound of recognition. Barnabas, showing no fear, walked right up to the great beast and stopped, standing calmly just inches from the bear's massive head. They looked at each other, the tiny donkey and the giant predator, sharing a moment of silent, perfect understanding that defied all logic. Jeremiah stared, his mind reeling. "It lives in the mine," he whispered in awe. And Barnabas, he knew it was here the whole time. The first horse screamed, a sound of pure animal terror. It bolted, its rider clinging on for dear life as it galloped blindly back down the treacherous mountain trail. The second horse reared violently, throwing its rider to the ground before it too fled in a panic. Brennan's horse was next, spinning and bucking, its eyes wide with fear. It wanted nothing to do with an 800-pound grizzly that was now taking slow, deliberate steps toward them. "This ain't over, Caldwell!" Brennan shrieked, yanking on the reins, his face a mask of terror. The bear took another step. Its massive paws left prints in the dirt the size of dinner plates. Every muscle in its body promised violence. It was closing the distance, and Brennan's horse was about to break. "Easy now," Jeremiah whispered, not sure who he was talking to. Barnabas then moved with quiet authority. He stepped between the bear and Brennan, not as a shield, but as a mediator. He turned his head toward the trail and let out a single, sharp bray. It was a command, and somehow, impossibly, both the bear and the horse seemed to understand it. In a flash, Brennan was gone, his horse finally finding its footing and scrambling down the mountain after the others, the fraudulent deed likely fluttering from his pocket into the canyon. The grizzly watched them go, a low rumble still vibrating in its chest. Then it turned, gave Barnabas one last long look, and lumbered back into the cool darkness of its cave. The silence it left behind was deafening. Jeremiah leaned against the rock wall, his legs suddenly weak. He looked at Barnabas, who had calmly returned to a patch of grass and started chewing as if nothing had happened. "Well, I'll be," Jeremiah breathed, a slow, dawning comprehension spreading through him. You have an arrangement, don't you?" The donkey just flicked an ear. He had led Jeremiah not just to a silver strike, but to its guardian. And in doing so, he had proven that this mountain had protectors far more powerful than any deed or any gun. But Jeremiah had a sinking feeling that Pete Morrison was not a man who gave up easily. The bear had solved one problem, but it had likely created a much bigger one. The door to the Deadwood assayer's office slammed shut, rattling the glass. Inside, 3 men in expensive suits paced the floor, their faces flushed with greed and frustration. The news had hit the town like a lightning strike. Jeremiah Caldwell's silver wasn't just good. It was the purest, richest strike the territory had ever seen. The assayer himself had locked the sample in his safe, his hands still trembling. Now, every shark and vulture for 500 miles was circling. "That old fool has no idea what he's sitting on," snarled Harrison Mills, a portly banker whose waistcoat buttons were straining under the pressure. He pulled a gold watch from his pocket. "He thinks this is about a few bags of silver. He doesn't understand." Outside, the town buzzed. People gathered on the boardwalks, their voices low and excited. The story of the worthless donkey and the grizzly bear guardian was already becoming a legend. Reporters were on their way from as far as Cheyenne. Back at the mine, Jeremiah sat on a crate, watching Barnabas munch on a bucket of the finest oats money could buy. In just a few weeks, the donkey's coat had transformed from a dull gray to a healthy, shining silver. His eyes were bright and alert. He looked like a different animal. "Looks like you're famous now, old friend," Jeremiah said, scratching the donkey's favorite spot behind his ears. "Funny, isn't it? A month ago, they wouldn't pay $5 for you. Now they'd probably pay 500. A dust cloud on the trail below signaled another visitor. This one was different. A fancy black carriage, pulled by 2 perfectly matched white horses, was bouncing its way up the rugged path at a reckless speed. The driver, perched high on his seat, wore a tall top hat. The carriage skidded to a halt, and a woman emerged. She was dressed in a vibrant blue gown, so laden with ruffles, it looked like a runaway wedding cake. She held a tiny white dog that yapped incessantly, its shrill barks echoing off the rock walls. "Mr. Caldwell!" she called out, her voice dripping with the kind of authority that came from a lifetime of never being told no. "I am Mrs. Victoria Pembroke. I have come all the way from Denver to make you an offer that will change your life." Barnabas lifted his head, his jaws still working on the oats. He studied the woman, his ears flicking back and forth, taking her measure. Mrs. Pembroke snapped open a large leather satchel and produced a stack of cash so thick it was obscene. The bills were crisp, new, and bound in neat bundles. $10,000, she announced, her voice ringing with triumph. "Cash. Right here, right now. For the donkey." Jeremiah's heart stopped. $10,000. It was an impossible sum. More money than the entire town of Deadwood saw in a month. It was enough to buy the biggest ranch in the territory, to live like a king for the rest of his days. He could feel the weight of that money, the sheer, intoxicating power of it. "Ma'am," he stammered, his throat suddenly dry. That's an incredible offer. I don't know what to say." "There's nothing to say," she trilled, her smile wide and predatory. "It's a simple transaction. You give me the animal, I give you the money. Everyone goes home happy." But as he looked at the pile of cash, and then at Barnabas, who was watching him with those calm, knowing eyes, Jeremiah felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This wasn't a simple transaction. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she wasn't just buying a donkey. She was buying the secret of the mine, and she would tear this mountain apart to get it. And then another, even more disturbing thought struck him. How did she know? How did she know it was the donkey, and not him, who held the key? The night was long and starless. Jeremiah didn't sleep. He paced the small perimeter of his camp, the fire crackling and spitting into the darkness. Mrs. Pembroke's offer echoed in his mind. $10,000. He kept seeing the faces of the people at the auction, their sneers and their laughter. He could go back there, walk into the general store, and buy the whole damn place. He could have respect. He could have security. He could have everything he'd never had. But every time he imagined taking the money, he saw Barnabas being led away, loaded onto that fancy carriage, disappearing down the mountain forever. He saw the confusion in the donkey's eyes, the betrayal. Martha's words came back to him again, clearer than ever. He sees the world differently. He was starting to understand what she meant. Barnabas didn't see rocks and dirt. He saw connections. He saw the lifeblood of the mountain. He saw the guardian bear not as a threat, but as a neighbor. He saw value in things no human could measure. And Pete Morrison saw it too. That was the piece that finally clicked into place for Jeremiah. Morrison hadn't sent Brennan up the mountain just for the silver. He was after the source. He knew somehow that the donkey was the divining rod. Mrs. Pembroke was just a different kind of claim jumper, one who used cash instead of guns. They all wanted to possess the magic, to own the miracle. They didn't understand that you couldn't put a cage around something like that. By morning, the sky was a canvas of pale pink and orange. Barnabas stood by the stream, drinking from the cold, clear water, his reflection shimmering on the surface. He was just a donkey. A small, gray, unassuming donkey. But he was also everything. Jeremiah walked over and stood beside him. "I think I've figured it out, old friend," he said quietly. Barnabas nudged him with his nose, a familiar, comforting gesture. Right on schedule, the dust cloud appeared on the trail. Mrs. Pembroke's carriage returned, this time with an entourage. Men in suits, a journalist with a notepad, a photographer lugging a giant box camera on a tripod. They looked like an invading army. "Mr. Caldwell!" Mrs. Pembroke called out, her voice bright and certain. "I trust you've come to your senses." Jeremiah walked to meet them, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture straight and tall. The group formed a semicircle around him, their faces a mixture of greed and impatience. "Ma'am," he began, his voice calm and even, "I've considered your offer. It's more money than a man like me ever thought he'd see." A smug smile spread across Mrs. Pembroke's face. She gestured to one of her men, who began unlatching the satchel of money. "But my answer," Jeremiah said, his eyes finding hers, "is no." The smile vanished from her face. The silence was absolute. Even the yapping dog was quiet for once. "No?" she sputtered, as if the word were a foreign language. "Did you say no? Nobody says no to $10,000. Are you insane?" "Maybe I am," Jeremiah said, a small smile playing on his lips. "But some things aren't for sale." He walked back to Barnabas and put a protective arm around the donkey's sturdy neck. "This animal right here is my partner. He's my friend. He trusted me when I was ready to give up on everything, including him. He saw something in this mountain, yes. But he also saw something in me." The photographer, sensing a historic moment, ducked under his black cloth, and the camera's flash powder erupted with a startling bang and a puff of white smoke. The image he captured would one day become famous. A simple farmer and his donkey, standing together against a world of greed. "What good is all that money?" Jeremiah continued, his voice resonating with a newfound strength. "If you have to sell your soul to get it." Mrs. Pembroke stared at him, her face a thunderous mask of disbelief and fury. She was a woman who was used to buying whatever she wanted. The idea that something, anything, was beyond the reach of her wealth was an insult she couldn't comprehend. Without another word, she spun on her heel, climbed back into her carriage, and slammed the door. As the carriage rattled away in a cloud of indignant dust, Jeremiah felt a sense of peace settle over him. But he knew this was far from over. He had defied two very powerful people. They wouldn't just walk away. They would be back. And next time, they wouldn't be bringing cash. They'd be bringing war. A week later, the war arrived. Not with guns, but with papers. The sheriff from Deadwood, a man named Cobb with a drooping mustache and reluctant eyes, rode up to the mine. With him was a circuit judge and Pete Morrison, who looked as smug as a fox in a henhouse. "Jeremiah Caldwell," the sheriff announced, reading from an official-looking document. "I have a court order here, an injunction. You are to cease all mining activity and vacate these premises immediately." "On what grounds?" Jeremiah demanded, his heart sinking. Morrison stepped forward, a triumphant sneer on his face. "On the grounds that you're a thief," he said smoothly. "This entire mountain, the Barnabas Lode, as the papers are calling it, was part of a parcel I purchased from the railroad 2 years ago. My deed predates your claim. You're a squatter." He produced his own deed, a crisp document covered in stamps and signatures. It looked far more official than Jeremiah's simple, hand-filed claim. "That's a lie," Jeremiah said, his voice shaking with rage. "You knew about this place. You were trying to get my donkey so he could lead you here." Morrison just laughed. "An interesting theory, Mr. Caldwell, but one that will be rather difficult to prove. A magical donkey? I think the judge will find my legally recorded deed a bit more compelling." The judge, a stern man with a face like granite, nodded grimly. "The law is the law. The deed appears to be in order. You have 48 hours to remove yourself and your property." And just like that, it was over. He had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted. Morrison had used the very system Jeremiah believed in to rob him blind. The story of his integrity, his loyalty to his friend, meant nothing in the face of a well-forged document and a corrupt system. Despair, cold and heavy, washed over him. As the three men rode away, Morrison turned in his saddle. "Should have taken the cash when you had the chance, old man," he called back. "Now you have nothing." That night, a storm rolled in, mirroring the tempest in Jeremiah's soul. Rain lashed against the small tent he'd pitched, and thunder echoed through the canyon. He sat on his cot, staring into the darkness, the court order clutched in his hand. He had lost. Everything Martha had believed in, everything Barnabas had given him, was gone. Barnabas stood just outside the tent, under a rocky overhang, seemingly untroubled by the storm. He occasionally looked over at Jeremiah, his dark eyes filled with a placid intelligence. There was something odd about the donkey tonight. He kept nudging a small leather pouch that hung from his harness. It had been there for as long as Jeremiah could remember. Martha had put it there years ago. He'd always assumed it was just a little charm, something she'd made to keep him safe. He'd never once thought to look inside. The donkey nudged it again, more insistently this time, then looked directly at Jeremiah. It was the same look of certainty he'd had at the bottom of the mountain. "Trust what Barnabas shows you." Martha's voice was so clear it was as if she were standing right beside him. With trembling fingers, Jeremiah reached out and untied the leather thong that held the pouch closed. It was old and worn, the leather softened by years of rain and sun. He tipped it over, and something small and hard fell into his palm. It wasn't a charm. It wasn't a lucky stone. It was a compass. A small brass compass, tarnished with age. But it wasn't an ordinary compass. The needle didn't point north. It spun wildly for a moment, then locked into place, pointing directly at the ground beneath their feet. Directly into the heart of the mountain. Jeremiah stared at it, his mind racing. Why would Martha give Barnabas a broken compass? He turned it over in his hand. There were letters scratched into the back, faint and worn. J. M. 1852. J. M. Josiah Morrison, Pete Morrison's grandfather. The local legend was that old Josiah had come into the Black Hills chasing rumors of a sacred Lakota mine, and had never been seen again. Everyone assumed he'd died in a blizzard or been killed by Indians. But this compass. This was his. Suddenly Barnabas nudged the compass in Jeremiah's hand, then turned and walked toward the entrance of the cave. He stopped and looked back, waiting. He wasn't just pointing to the silver. He was pointing to something else. Something connected to that compass. Something old Josiah Morrison had left behind. Jeremiah grabbed his lantern. The injunction, the 48-hour deadline, none of it mattered anymore. There was another story hidden in this cave, a much older one, and he had a feeling it held the key to his survival. Following Barnabas, Jeremiah entered the cave, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the damp walls. The compass in his hand was warm, its needle humming with a faint vibration, pulling him deeper into the earth. It led him past the main silver vein, down a narrow, winding passage he had never noticed before, one that was almost completely hidden by a rockslide. He had to crawl on his hands and knees to get through, the sharp rocks tearing at his clothes. On the other side, the passage opened into a small, natural cavern. The air here was different, still and sacred. The walls were covered not in tool marks but in ancient pictographs, painted in red and black ochre. They told the story of the mountain, of the sky, and of a great bear spirit that guarded the star metal within, a metal that had fallen from the heavens. And in the center of the chamber, wedged into a crevice, was a rotted leather satchel. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached for it. The leather was so old it practically disintegrated in his hands. Inside was a journal, its pages brittle and yellowed with age, and a piece of paper, carefully folded and wrapped in oilskin. He unwrapped the paper first. It was a mining claim. The original claim for this entire mountain, filed in 1852 by Josiah Morrison. It described the star metal silver in detail, but scrawled across the bottom, in a shaky hand, were the words, "Claim abandoned. This place is not ours to take. May God forgive my greed." It was a relinquishment. Josiah Morrison had found the mine, realized its sacred nature, and legally abandoned his claim to it. Pete Morrison's deed, the one he'd purchased from the railroad, was worthless. The railroad could only sell land that was unclaimed. And this land hadn't been unclaimed. It had been protected by Josiah's final act of conscience. Then, Jeremiah opened the journal. The last entry, dated just days after the claim was abandoned, was terrifying. "The spirit of the mountain is angry," Josiah wrote. "I hear it moving in the darkness. I should have listened to the Lakota. They said the guardian does not suffer trespassers. I see its eyes in the shadows. This metal is a curse. It does not bring wealth, only a hollow, hungry madness. I will not leave this cave. My greed has sealed my tomb." Jeremiah looked up from the journal, a profound horror washing over him. Josiah Morrison hadn't disappeared in a blizzard. He had died right here, in this very chamber, likely at the claws of the guardian bear of his time. Pete Morrison wasn't just a liar and a thief. He was a fool, chasing a cursed legacy that had destroyed his own grandfather. And the compass. He looked at the strange device again. The needle wasn't pointing north. It was pointing to the star metal, the silver that had fallen from the sky. It wasn't broken. It was a lodestone compass, attuned to the unique magnetic properties of the meteorite ore that laced the silver veins. It was a key. A key Martha must have found, or been given, years ago. A key she had entrusted to the one creature she knew could be trusted to understand it. Barnabas. He had everything he needed. The proof. The truth. Justice was no longer a matter of law, but a matter of history, and he had exactly 24 hours to bring that history into the light. The next morning, Jeremiah Caldwell walked into the Deadwood Saloon where Pete Morrison was holding court, buying drinks for the entire room and bragging about his new acquisition. Jeremiah didn't say a word. He just walked up to the bar, slapped Josiah Morrison's journal down on the stained wood, and opened it to the last page. Morrison's laughter died in his throat. His face went pale. He lunged for the book, but Jeremiah was faster, holding it up for everyone to see. "This is your grandfather's last will and testament, Pete," Jeremiah said, his voice ringing through the suddenly silent saloon. "He called this mine a curse. He died in that cave, running from the same greed that's eating you alive." He then produced the original, abandoned claim. "And this," he said, holding it up, "is his legal relinquishment. The railroad sold you land they never owned. Your deed is worthless." Men who had been drinking Morrison's whiskey just moments before now backed away from him, their eyes wide. The story of the bear, the donkey, and the sacred mine had captivated the town. Now, this final ghostly chapter sealed it. Morrison was not just a cheat. He was a ghoul, trying to profit from the grave of his own ancestor. Just then, Sheriff Cobb pushed through the saloon doors, Mrs. Victoria Pembroke right behind him, her face a mask of cold fury. "Caldwell," the sheriff began, "your 48 hours are—" "It's all right, Sheriff," Jeremiah said calmly. "Mr. Morrison and I were just clearing up a little matter of inheritance." He handed the journal and the abandoned claim to the stunned sheriff. "You'll find that Mr. Morrison has no legal right to that mountain. He never did." Mrs. Pembroke, realizing she had been duped into backing a fraud, turned on Morrison. "You fool!" she shrieked. "You told me the title was clear. I've lost a fortune on your lies! The tide had turned. Morrison, exposed and humiliated, tried to bluster his way out. It's a forgery. He's a crazy old man. But no one was listening. The truth, once revealed, was as solid and immovable as the mountain itself. Sheriff Cobb, after examining the documents and the dates, looked at Morrison with disgust. "Pete," he said, his voice heavy with finality, "you're under arrest for fraud." As they led a sputtering, defeated Pete Morrison away in handcuffs, a space cleared around Jeremiah. The townspeople looked at him with a new respect, a kind of awe. He hadn't just found silver. He had uncovered a truth that had been buried for decades. He had faced down power and greed with nothing but courage and the quiet wisdom of a scraggly gray donkey. He walked out of the saloon and into the bright Dakota sunshine. Barnabas was waiting for him, tied to a hitching post, patiently chewing on a loose piece of hay. Jeremiah walked up to his friend and put his arm around his neck, burying his face in the coarse, familiar fur. "You knew all along, didn't you?" he whispered. "You were never leading me to silver. You were leading me to this, to the truth." Barnabas just nudged him gently with his nose. The silver mine made Jeremiah a wealthy man, but he never became a tycoon. He used the money to pay off his debts, rebuild his farm, and set up a fund to help other struggling families in the territory. He worked the mine sparingly and respectfully, never taking more than he needed, always honoring the spirit of the place. He ensured the inner cavern, Josiah's tomb, was sealed and protected, a permanent monument to the dangers of unchecked greed. The story of Jeremiah and Barnabas became a cornerstone of Dakota legend. A tale about how true wealth isn't what you can dig out of the ground, but what you find in loyalty, friendship, and the courage to listen to the quiet voices the rest of the world is too busy to hear. Years later, people would still see the old man and his donkey walking the hills. Two partners, two friends, who had found a treasure far more valuable than silver. They had found peace. If you enjoyed this story of loyalty and justice, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You never know what other hidden treasures we might uncover together.